Eli Mercer was halfway to town with a wedding ring in his coat pocket when he heard something crying where nothing living should have been. The sound came up from the cottonwoods by Little Goose Creek, thin and raw under the scrape of thawing ice, and it made his mare plant her feet so hard the bridle leather snapped against his glove. He had one road that would put him in Ruth Calder's store before noon, and another that dropped off the trail into brush and meltwater, and whatever trouble made a noise like that. For a long moment he sat there with the cold needling through his clean shirt, a man dressed to ask for a wife, listening to something in the creek bottom beg not to be left. Before we follow him down there, tell me where you are listening from tonight. A kitchen in Alberta, a porch in Georgia, a small room in Perth, somewhere the dishes are drying and the day is finally done. It does a story good to know what lamps are burning while it is told. He swung down, looped the reins over a branch, and pushed through the cottonwoods. The mud took at his boots. The creek smelled of old snow and black earth waking up. He found the mother first. She lay twisted in the reeds with iron on one hind leg and blood frozen dark on the silver of her fur. Someone had put a rifle ball behind her shoulder after the trap held. Her teeth were bared, not from anger now, but from the stiffening that comes after it. The pup was wedged against her belly, blind with hunger and rage, chewing the dead fur as if force alone might bring milk back. Eli stood over them with one hand inside his coat, touching the ring through the lining. The county paid $2 a hide for wolves. Silas Boone had said all winter that any man who wanted to keep calves in this valley had better help thin them. Eli himself had lost 2 heifers the year before to a pack-up on the North Ridge. He knew what wolves could do. He also knew what it sounded like when one small thing had run clean out of reasons not to cry. The pup turned on him when he reached down. It was little more than fur and bone, but it came with both front feet braced and mouth wide, trying to bite through his glove. He let it. The teeth were no more than pins. He worked the trap jaw loose from the mother's leg, pried the chain free of a root, and for reasons he would not have been able to explain to a preacher or a banker or the woman waiting in town if she had been waiting, he wrapped the pup inside his coat and carried it out against his chest. It did not settle. It clawed at his shirt and hissed against the beat of his heart. By the time he got back to the mare, there were 4 bright scratches across his neck and a warm spot under his arm where the thing had finally gone limp from hunger. He looked toward town once. Beyond the rise, the road ran clean and pale in the spring light, promising exactly what every sensible person had urged on him for months. Ruth Calder was a widow with a steady hand, a store that would not last another year without help, and the same quiet weariness around her eyes that Eli saw in the mirror when he shaved. No one had called it love. In a place like theirs, people did not always insist on love. They asked whether a house would be less empty with 2 people in it than with one, and sometimes that was enough. He touched the ring again, then turned the mare toward home. His ranch sat 5 miles north of the creek, tucked into a fold of pasture where the wind came down clean off the bighorns. The house had been built before he owned it, then added onto badly, then neglected in the rooms no one used after the winter Lottie died. Eli kept the kitchen warm, the tack room square, the barn honest, and the rest of the place could do as it pleased. That was how men lived when they had decided surviving and living were close enough to the same thing. He poured goat milk into a chipped cup, tore a strip from an old flour sack, and made a rag teat the way his mother used to feed weak lambs. The pup fought him until the milk touched its tongue. Then it drank with such fury he had to pull it back twice to keep it from choking. Its ears were too large for its head. One front paw had a raw place across the pad where the trap chain must have struck it while it fought beside its mother. When it finished, it made one small sound that was not a growl and not quite a whimper either, then slept against his palm like a coal that had not decided whether to go out. He ought to have taken it back out and ended it clean. That was what a man with cattle and any sense would do. But Eli had gentled horses no one else could get a saddle on, and he knew there was a narrow stretch between terror and trust where a life could go either way. Push too hard, and you lost it. Step away too soon, and you lost it just the same. Near sundown, Noah Pike came riding through the gate on a buckskin pony too small for his long knees. Noah was 14, all elbows and appetite, with a whistle through the gap where his front teeth had been knocked out by a gate chain the previous autumn. He brought mail once a week from town for the extra 50 cents Mrs. Pike liked to mention whenever Eli forgot a payment. Noah stepped into the kitchen, smelled the milk, and froze when he saw the fur bundle by the stove. That a wolf? Eli did not look up from the strip of cloth he was winding around the pup's paw. Seems to be. Noah let out that little whistle through his teeth. Mr. Boone will have a fit. He has the health for it. Noah's eyes bounced from the pup to Eli's clean shirt hanging over the chair back. You go to town? No. You aiming to? Not now. The boy understood more than Eli wanted him to. By morning the whole valley would know he had not gone courting. By afternoon they would know why. Miss Calder had 3 new bolts of calico in yesterday, Noah said, too carefully. Ma said she was sweeping the front walk twice before 10. Eli tied off the bandage. His hands were steady. Only his jaw moved. Mail. Noah gave him the letters and a folded circular from the Cheyenne stock agents. When he left, he was still looking over his shoulder at the stove. Dark came down blue and wide over the pasture. The pup woke twice to feed, then curled its narrow body against the inside of Eli's wrist as if it had chosen the bone there for shelter. He sat in the kitchen until the lamp burned low. At some point, he took the ring from his pocket and laid it on the table. It left a pale circle in the dust. He was staring at that circle the next morning when a wagon stopped outside. Ruth Calder did not knock like a timid woman. She opened the door, brought in the smell of cold air and dry goods, and closed it with her hip. She was taller than most women in the county and held herself as if she had long ago learned there was no use making herself smaller for people who would not think better of her for it. Her brown hair had loosened from its pins in the wind. There was flour on one cuff and anger in both eyes. I had to hear from Noah Pike, she said. I do hope you are ashamed. Eli stood. He had faced blizzards, a horse rolling on him, and the night Lottie bled out with the doctor still 6 miles away. None of it made him as instantly awkward as Ruth Calder in his kitchen. I was coming in. You were not. You were sitting right here deciding how long a decent woman could be kept waiting before the apology got cheaper. Then she saw the basket by the stove. The anger did not leave her face at once. It changed shape. She crossed the room and bent over the pup, who lifted its head and gave her a weak warning growl. Ruth looked from the bandaged paw to the rag teat drying by the sink to the old ring on the table. Oh, she said, and there was something much worse than anger in it. Not hurt exactly. Recognition. He wished suddenly that she would go back to being furious. That he knew what to do with. I found it in a trap by the creek, he said. Mother was dead. I turned back. You turned back from asking me to marry you for that. He met her eyes because anything else would have been cowardice. I turned back because carrying that thing up out of the reeds, I understood I was on my way to ask you for the wrong reason. The room went quiet except for the stove ticking and the pup's rough little breathing. Ruth straightened. And what reason was that? I was tired of hearing my own boots in this house. The truth landed between them, plain and ugly and somehow cleaner than any softer lie would have been. Ruth looked at him a long while. Then she took off her gloves finger by finger and laid them on the table. Move, she said. He stepped aside. She touched the pup's bandage, gentler than he had expected from a woman who had come for blood. You wrapped it too tight. I did not. You did. She glanced up at him. You always knot things like they are going to argue. He almost smiled. He had not expected anything in the room to loosen. She re-wrapped the paw with surer fingers, then fed the pup a little warm milk from the cloth strip. It fought less for her than it had for him. That nettled him in a place he preferred not to examine. When she finished, she reached for her gloves again, but voices sounded outside. More than one horse. Male voices. Unhurried. Confident. Silas Boone filled Eli's doorway the way some men fill a pulpit, by acting as if the room has been waiting on them. He was broad through the chest, and still powerful in the shoulders despite his age. His coat was expensive, his beard trimmed close, his eyes pale as old nails. Behind him stood Sheriff Kell and Boone's son Warren, young and handsome, and already wearing the easy meanness of a man who mistakes inheritance for character. Boone's gaze found the basket at once. Well, he said. Noah was not lying. Ruth put herself half a step in front of the stove before she seemed to know she had done it. Boone noticed that too. Mrs. Calder. Mr. Boone. He turned back to Eli. You planning to nurse predators now? Planning to keep what I found, Eli said. Sheriff Kell shifted his hat in his hands. County ordinance is plain on wolves, Eli. County ordinance didn't watch a starving pup try to nurse a dead mother. Boone smiled without warmth. You keep that thing, Mercer, and every calf lost from here to Dry Creek will be laid at your door. Men are nervous enough already. Snow ran late. Grass is thin. And I have no intention of letting sentiment crawl into business. He let his eyes rest on Ruth a beat too long. Some choices cost more than they look. Then he stepped aside, letting the threat stay in the room after him like smoke. Warren's mouth twitched as if the whole thing amused him. Sheriff Kell looked tired. In another moment they were gone. Eli shut the door and set the bar down. The pup stirred. Ruth's face had gone pale, not with fear exactly, but with the sort of knowledge a person gets when they see how far trouble intends to come. The world had been one thing when he woke that morning. A lonely ranch, a tired widower, a practical hope folded in a coat pocket. By noon there was a wolf pup by his stove, Boone at his gate, and Ruth Calder standing in his kitchen with her gloves off as if she had not yet decided whether to help him or leave him to burn. She looked at the ring on the table, then at the pup, then at him. "You had better keep it alive," she said. In the days that followed, Eli named the pup Ash because its coat along the spine carried that dull gray color left in a stove after the good fire was gone. It was not a pet name, and that seemed to suit them both. Ash took milk every 4 hours, slept in a wooden crate by the kitchen stove, and bit first at everything that reached toward it. Eli's hands became a map of thin red lines. Ruth, who now came out every other day with one excuse or another, laughed once when Ash latched onto the cuff of his shirt and hung there stubborn as a burr. "You look offended," she said. "I am feeding it." That does not oblige gratitude. He was crouched by the crate, one knee crackling because the weather had turned and old injuries always knew first. "You got a notion everything wants to be charmed." "No, I have a notion that not everything frightened deserves to be punished for it." She said it while lifting Ash's bandaged paw and checking the healing skin underneath. There was nothing solemn in her tone. It was only a woman speaking the plainest truth available to her in that moment. Still, it settled into the room and stayed there. "A scared thing ain't mean," she said. "It's just got no reason to trust a hand yet." Ash blinked up at her, milk on its whiskers. Eli looked down at his own scarred knuckles and said nothing. Ruth's store stood on Main Street in Sheridan, narrow at the front and deep at the back, with barrels of flour by the stove and shelves of thread, nails, lamp chimneys, and jar candies for children with nickels to waste. Since her husband Thomas died 3 years before, she had kept the books herself, ordered her own stock, lifted her own sacks when the freight boys were slow, and learned exactly how kindly a town could speak to a woman while waiting for her to fail. Eli began riding in on Saturdays under the excuse of feed accounts he could have settled once a month. He would tie his mare outside, stand by the stove, and watch Ruth wrap purchases in brown paper with quick, capable hands. She had a way of listening with her whole face that made people tell her more than they meant to. She asked questions other women might have let pass. How much creek water had come through the north pasture? Whether he still woke before dawn on storm nights, even when there was no one left to lose. Whether he truly believed silence and honesty were the same thing. He answered some. Others he carried home. The valley reacted to Ash exactly as valleys do to anything that challenges their favorite certainty. Mrs. Pike sent over goat milk and said it was sinful, but perhaps no more sinful than leaving a baby beast to starve. Noah worshipped the ground Ash walked on and would have slept in the crate if Eli allowed it. Men at Boone's place spat in the dirt when Eli rode by. 2 boys from the South Fork tossed stones at the house one evening and ran when Ash, still small, threw itself at the porch steps in a fit of fury, so oversized it might have been comic if it had not sounded so lonely. By early May the pup had outgrown the crate. Eli built a pen against the barn with fresh pine rails and enough space to keep it from feeling cornered. Ash hated the pen on sight. It paced until its paws bled, not because it meant to escape so much as because wild things cannot bear the shape of walls without asking whether they deserve them. Ruth arrived that afternoon with a tin of salve and found Eli standing inside the pen, arms folded, while Ash pressed itself against the far boards and glared. "You are both impossible," she said. "It'll lame itself. It thinks you are making a prison. It's a fence." Ruth smiled a little. There is not always much difference from the wrong side of one. She climbed the rail before he could object and crouched near Ash without reaching. She spoke in a low voice about nothing at all, about a crate of peaches that had finally come in ripe, about Noah Pike stealing gumdrops one red one at a time because he believed theft became invisible if done politely, about a mourning dove nesting in the store sign. After 5 minutes, Ash stopped pacing. After 10, it came 3 steps nearer. Ruth set the salve down and held still. Eli watched her and thought, not for the first time, that some people do not soften a room by making less of themselves. They do it by not asking anyone else to do the same. When she rose, the hem of her skirt brushed the dirt. You cannot keep a wolf by force. I know. Then what are you trying to keep? He leaned on the rail and looked toward the pasture, where last year's grass lay flat under the new green. Fences, he knew, could look straight from a distance and still fail at the first real pressure. People were not much different. I haven't decided, he said. She did not make him say more. The trouble came with the first dead calf. Noah Pike found it near the South Wash, half a mile from Eli's line, and fetched both men before noon. The carcass lay on its side with the throat torn and one flank opened. Flies had already started. The smell of blood sat thick in the warming air. Boone arrived before Eli finished kneeling over the tracks. Well? Boone asked. Eli looked at the ground again. Not a wolf. Boone gave a sharp laugh. Convenient. Tracks are wrong. 2 splayed. More than 1 dog, maybe 3. Wolves take cleaner. Warren Boone kicked at the dirt with the toe of his boot. Looks dead enough either way. Ruth had come in Noah's wagon with bandages for Mrs. Pike's hand and stayed when she saw the crowd by the wash. She stood just behind Eli now, eyes moving from track to track as if she trusted him more than the men sneering around him. Silas Boone clasped his gloves behind his back. A man nursing a wolf under his own roof loses the right to lecture cattlemen on what killed their calves. Then hire a tracker, Eli said. I am looking at one. Only this one has grown sentimental. The word hit harder than it should have. Sentimental. As if mercy were a softness. As if only cruel things counted as practical. Eli stood. Dog or wolf, it did not come from my place. Boone's expression smoothed into that expensive calm he wore when he was about to make someone smaller. Perhaps not. But if more losses come, the association will expect certainty, and certainty is easier to come by when the problem is sitting in a pen behind your barn. He left the threat there in front of everyone. That was his talent, not rage. Arrangement. By the end of the week, there were 2 more calves down, both closer to Eli's north fence than Boone's men liked. By then the story had become bigger than hoofprints. It was about what kind of man harbored danger and called it kindness. It was about whether lonely men had poor judgment. It was about whether Ruth Calder, already the subject of too much town curiosity, had thrown herself in with a fool. Boone sent word that the note on her store loan would be called due at month's end unless certain obligations were made more secure. Ruth read the letter in Eli's kitchen, folded it once, and set it under the sugar bowl as if it were a grocery list and not a hand tightening around her throat. He means to scare you off me, Eli said. He means to take the store, Ruth answered. Scaring me is only the method. He wanted to say he would pay it. He had enough if he sold the north strip by the creek, and Boone knew it. That was likely the whole point. But saying it would turn Ruth into another debt, he imagined himself strong enough to carry. She would not forgive that from a man who had already tried once to make convenience sound like care. Instead, he said, I can track what did it. And if you do, then Boone loses his story. Ruth looked toward the pen where Ash lay stretched in evening light, no longer tiny but still all legs and suspicion. Then you had better do it before he makes the story law. She stayed for supper. They ate beans and cold salt pork and bread she had brought wrapped in cloth. The kitchen window stood open to the smell of damp earth. Ash nosed the threshold and lay down there, as if guarding the room without admitting it. When Ruth was leaving, she paused by the door. The last gold of the day caught in the loose hair near her temple. It is worth asking, she said, not quite looking at him. What a person owes the thing that trusted him first. He watched her walk to the wagon, then stood in the doorway long after the sound of wheels had gone. And maybe that is the question to hold for a moment before the dark comes on stronger. What would you have trusted in Eli's place then? The warning of good, sensible neighbors, or the first small creature in years that had leaned its full weight against him without asking what kind of man he had been before? He and Ruth found the answer began in the tracks, but did not end there. The next carcass lay near a stand of chokecherry at the edge of Boone land. Eli went at dawn with Ruth beside him in the wagon because she said 2 sets of eyes were better than 1, and because neither of them was bothering much with excuses anymore. The flies were quieter in the cool hour. Dew soaked the hem of Ruth's skirt. Eli crouched near the drag marks, one hand on the dirt. Dogs pushed it, he said. See how they scattered? Wolves work closer. Ruth followed the line of the prints into brush, then bent to pick something off a thorn. It was a strip of blue calico no wider than her little finger. She frowned. I sold 3 yards of this Monday. To who? She looked up. Warren Boone. The revelation did not solve anything. A man could buy cloth for 100 reasons, but it pulled a thread where until then there had only been mud and suspicion. That same night, Ash woke Eli with a growl so deep it sounded impossible from a creature not yet grown. Moonlight lay white across the yard. The cattle in the north field were running the fence. He grabbed his boots and rifle and shouted for the hand sleeping in the bunkhouse. But Jeb had gone to town after supper and had not returned. By the time Eli got to the pasture, 3 rangy dogs were among the yearlings, nipping hocks and driving them toward the open cut that led west. Not wolves. Hounds gone mean or trained to it. He fired once into the air. 2 broke. The third turned long enough for him to see the leather collar at its neck before it vanished into the brush. By morning, 1 yearling was down with a broken leg and had to be shot. Ruth came before noon, having seen Boone's men riding already. This is what he wants, Eli said. Boone's offer arrived not long after. Not in writing. Men like Boone preferred the personal touch when they believed they were being generous. He dismounted at the gate and looked at the lame yearling where Eli had dragged it clear of the barn. Sell me the North Creek pasture, he said. Shoot the wolf. I'll see the claims are handled and Mrs. Calder's note forgotten. Ruth had come out onto the porch at the sound of his voice. Boone did not look at her. Eli felt something cold and precise settle in him. There it was, the easy path and the hard one, each dressed plain enough to be mistaken for the other. No, Boone studied him. You think stubbornness is character. It is only expensive. What your son bought blue calico for? Eli asked. It was a small thing, but Boone's eyes altered. Not much. A tightening at the corners. Enough. When you are done inventing insults for decent families, he said. You may recall, I am still the man holding both your futures in my hand. He turned his horse and rode out. That evening Ruth closed the store early. Eli found her in the back room with ledgers open on the counter and her spectacles low on her nose, a detail he had never seen before and could not have guessed would move him. He bought lamp oil, chain, and raw meat on credit, she said without looking up. All charged to feed for kennel dogs he does not own. You keeping kennel accounts now? I am keeping every account that lies to me. She ran a finger down the page. Her handwriting beneath the numbers was neat and disciplined, a person forcing order on whatever could still be ordered. There were other purchases. Not just Warren. Boone's foreman signed for carbolic, trap springs, and 2 salt sacks the week before you found the pup. Eli leaned over the counter. He could smell soap at Ruth's wrist and the dry paper of the ledger. Can you prove anything? Not yet. Outside, wagon wheels passed on the street. A child laughed. The ordinary sounds of town went on around them as if ordinary life had not already shifted a little off its center. Ruth closed the book. If we are going to stop him, we need what he cannot talk over. Dogs, calves, marks, men he paid, something the whole county can see. Eli nodded. Then we go where the tracks go. They left before dawn the next morning and followed the dog line west through scrub, across a dry wash, and into a narrow limestone break Boone men used in summer to shelter loose horses. The place opened suddenly into a box canyon hidden from the road by juniper and stone. What they heard first was not cattle, but dogs. 3 of them, lean and scarred, chained in shade near a rock overhang. Beyond them stood 6 calves in a makeshift pen, all wearing brands that had been cut and burned over badly enough to pass at auction if a buyer did not look twice. Ruth let out one slow breath. Eli's jaw locked. Stolen, he said, or moved before branding and written off as losses. Then they heard another sound, a boot scraping stone behind them. Warren Boone stood at the mouth of the break with 2 hired men and a smile that had never learned shame. He held a rifle low, like a man who preferred the threat before the act. You should have taken the pasture, he said. What followed happened fast and jagged. Eli went for the nearest man, not the rifle. He knew enough to close distance before fear could think itself brave. They went down hard in dust and sage. Ruth ran for the dog chains because she had seen what Eli had seen, that if panic took those calves in a canyon this tight, nobody would control where the weight went. One hired hand grabbed her arm. She drove her elbow into his throat and yanked free. Warren fired. The shot cracked off stone and set the canyon roaring with cattle noise. The dogs went wild against their chains. One calf burst through the weak rail and slammed another sideways. In seconds, the whole pen turned into muscle and horns in blind terror. Eli got to his feet with blood down one cheek, just as the hired man he had hit lunged again. They crashed into the post holding the dog line. The stake ripped loose. Two dogs bolted straight into the calves. Ruth reached the lead rope at the canyon mouth and cut it with Eli's skinning knife. The gate sagged open. That saved them for one breath and imperiled them the next, because now the calves had somewhere to run. Out they came in a brown pounding flood. Eli caught Ruth by the shoulders and threw her against the rock wall as the first animals tore past. Dust filled his mouth. One horn ripped his sleeve from wrist to elbow. He saw Warren scrambling for higher ground, saw one hired man lose his footing under the hooves, saw the dogs spinning madly in the surge they had helped create. Then smoke hit. A lantern, kicked or dropped in the fight, had broken under the overhang where the dry grass and old feed were stacked. Fire moved quick in country, starved for rain. It ran low and mean along the base of the rock, then leaped at the brush near the canyon mouth. Ruth pushed herself upright, coughing. Eli. He looked once at the fire, once at the calves escaping into open country, and once at Warren Boone, who had climbed the ledge and was aiming down again, not at the herd now, but at something moving through the smoke below. Ash. The half-grown wolf came out of the juniper like a thrown shadow, drawn by noise or loyalty or the simple refusal to leave the only place it knew. It went not for the cattle but for the third dog, the one circling back toward Eli's mare tied outside the break. The two animals hit in a twist of fur and teeth. Warren raised the rifle. Eli moved before thought could catch up. He snatched a rock from the wash and hurled it. It struck Warren's wrist. The shot went wide, into stone, showering splinters. Then the fire found the brush at the canyon mouth in earnest, and the whole way out became a wall of heat, shoving flame between them and the open ground where the calves were scattering toward Boone's lower pasture. Ruth's face was streaked black with soot. Eli could not tell whether the wet on her cheek was sweat or fear. The world had narrowed to three things: fire rising, cattle running, a wolf fighting a dog in smoke thick enough to blind. And the hardest part was not danger. It was choice. Save the proof. Save the herd. Save the creature everybody had told him would ruin him. No man could do all three at once. And by then the flames were asking for an answer. He looked at Ruth. She looked back. Neither of them had time to say what the next minute would cost. When Eli woke, it was to the taste of iron and wet cloth and someone wiping soot from the side of his neck with hands that were trying very hard not to shake. The room smelled of fever tea, singed wool, and rain on hot dirt. Outside, a horse stamped under the eaves. Ruth sat beside the bed in his back room with her sleeves rolled and her hair entirely down, a thing he had not seen and would not have trusted himself to see clearly even if he had. A lamp burned low on the crate that had once held Ash. Eli's ribs hurt when he breathed. His left shoulder felt packed with broken glass. "You were under your horse," Ruth said, not wasting softness on surprise. "Sheriff Kell and Noah Pike got you clear after the fire crossed west. Jeb found the scattered calves by the Boone pasture before dawn. Two of them still had cut brands on them." Eli tried to sit. The room buckled. Ruth put a hand flat against his chest and pushed once, firmly enough to settle the matter. "A man can be stubborn lying down," she said. "Try it." He closed his eyes until the wave passed. "Ash." She was quiet just long enough to make pain turn sharp in him. "Outside," she said at last. "Limping. Alive." He breathed again. The fire had taken the overhang, one wagon, and most of Warren Boone's kennel gear before Boone's own riders, and half the valley beat it down. The hidden pin was gone, but not before 6 frightened calves had burst out in full view of 3 men who knew brands. One hired hand had ridden off that night and not yet come back. The other, trampled at the edge of the break, had spoken enough through a broken jaw for Sheriff Kell to understand the shape of things. Not all of them. Enough. Eli slept and woke by pieces over 2 days. Ruth stayed. Mrs. Pike sent broth. Noah ran messages. Jeb chopped wood with unusual quiet. Ash lay under the porch at first, then nearer the kitchen steps. Not tame and never likely to be, but choosing the house now in a way it had not before. On the third evening, the rain stopped and gold light leaned through the west window. Ruth helped Eli into a chair by the stove. He moved like a man learning his own bones from the outside in. For a while they said nothing. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like a room with the door shut against weather. Ruth sat opposite him with a cup cooling in both hands. There was a burn across the back of one wrist where the lantern must have caught her in the canyon. Eli looked at it too long. "You should have let Mrs. Pike do the bandage," he said. "She talks when she raps. That is not a flaw. It is when a person is tired." He nodded. His gaze fell to the small object on the table beside her cup. It was a tin horse, no bigger than his thumb, worn bright at the ears. Ruth touched it with one finger. "It was my daughter Clarice." He looked up. In all the weeks since she first came angry into his kitchen, they had passed around the edges of certain griefs, naming them only by their shadows. Not because either lacked courage, because naming a loss aloud can make it newly final. "She used to carry it in her apron," Ruth said. "Dropped it once in flour, and I found it by the print of the hoof." Her mouth moved as if the memory hurt and pleased her at once. "After she died, Thomas packed away everything else. Said it was kinder. I kept this because he never thought to look in my sewing basket." Eli rested his forearms on his knees. "How old?" "6. He swallowed. My boy lived 3 hours. Ruth's eyes rose slowly to his. There it was. The room they had both avoided. The one at the center of everything. "She bled," he said. The words came rough, like stones dislodged after a thaw. "Lottie. Doctor was in town. Snow came hard. I had a mare foaling and 2 cows down in the lower lot. I told myself there was time for all of it if I moved quick enough." He let out a breath that had lived in him for years. "There was not." Ruth set her cup aside. "You were one man in a storm. I was a husband making choices." "Yes." Her voice did not spare him. It also did not condemn him. "And you have been punishing the survivor ever since." Something in his face must have given way then, because she crossed the little space between them without another word and sat on the stool near his chair. Not in his lap, not wrapped around him. None of the easy lies lonely people sometimes reach for when they cannot stand the distance between pain and comfort. She only sat close enough that her knee touched his. He stared at the floorboards. "I did not ask you because I loved you. I know that." "No," Ruth said. "You asked because you were tired." He nodded once. "And I would have said yes," she went on, "because I was frightened." That turned him toward her. "My store. My note. My future. All of it." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I had gotten so used to carrying every hard thing myself, I had begun to mistake exhaustion for strength." The light had gone softer by then. Outside, ash moved under the window, the nails of one paw clicking faint against the porch plank. Ruth looked not at Eli but at the tin horse in her hand. Lonely is only heavy when you keep carrying it alone. The room held the words without needing to improve them. He put his hand out slowly, and when she let him, he took the little tin horse from her palm as carefully as if it were still beloved by a child. He closed his fingers around it, and in that simple passing of metal from one life into another, more was said than either of them could have managed with courage alone. If that found something tender in you tonight, you know why stories like this matter. Leave a like, subscribe if you want more of them, and stay with us a little longer, because the world outside that room had not yet finished deciding what kind of people Eli Mercer and Ruth Calder were allowed to become. Boone came the next morning without his son. The old cattleman looked older somehow, as if the fire had burned off whatever polish authority usually gave him. He stood on the porch with his hat in both hands, and his pride still mostly intact. "Kel says the hearing will be Saturday," he said. "Association men will want damages named." Eli sat in a chair by the window, shoulder-bound, Ruth standing behind him with one hand resting on the back rail. Ash lay under the porch steps below, unseen but not unfelt. Boone's gaze drifted once toward the yard. "Warren was a fool." "You knew enough," Ruth said. His jaw worked. "I knew he was restless. Wasteful. I did not know he had taken to moving calves and blaming dogs for the shortfall." "Because it suited you not to know," Ruth answered. He did not deny it. That was something. There was a long pause. Wind moved the cottonwood leaves. Somewhere in the barn Jeb dropped a wrench. "At the hearing," Boone said, "you may ask for more than you lost. Men will give it. They smell blood when power slips." He looked directly at Eli then. "If you intend to ruin my family, do it plain." Eli's hand closed once on the arm of the chair. Here was another choice, quieter than the one in the canyon and in some ways harder. He could ask for every missing calf ever argued over, every expense from the fire, every inch of Boone land that touched his water. The valley, guilty for misjudging him, might even cheer it on. Ruth said nothing. But when Eli looked up, she was watching him with that still attention of hers, not pleading, only bearing witness. Saturday came warm and bright, which felt almost offensive after the week they had lived through. The hearing was held in the back room of the livery because there were too many men for the sheriff's office and too much curiosity for privacy. Boots lined the wall. Flies bumped the window glass. Noah Pike stood on an upturned feed bucket near the door until Mrs. Pike yanked him down by the collar. Sheriff Kell laid out what he had. 2 calves recovered from the box canyon, with cut brands still visible under the burns. 1 hired hand willing to testify that Warren Boone had set the dogs on stock to hide thefts from his father's books. Store ledgers showing purchases inconsistent with any lawful kennel on Boone property. Trap springs and poison bait found in a locked shed after the fire, the same pattern of trap used on the she-wolf by Little Goose Creek. Warren sat pale at the back, his right wrist bandaged where Eli's rock had struck him. Silas Boone stood beside him, straight as a fence post in frost. When the time came for Eli Mercer to speak, the room shifted the way rooms do when people realize the person they counted out has become the hinge. He stood carefully, one hand on the chair back. "What I lost," he said, "was 1 yearling, a week of work, and a piece of trust this valley should not spend so cheap again." A murmur moved through the men. Boone's eyes narrowed, not in threat now, but in uncertainty. Eli went on, "I want payment for the yearling. I want Ruth Calder's store note struck clean. I want every trap on Boone land pulled and every poison bait burned where all of us can see it. And I want it written that no further stock losses are to be laid at my place without tracks examined by more than 1 man." That was all. He could have gone further. Everyone in the room knew it. Sheriff Kell's pen paused above the page. Noah Pike stared as if disappointed in the entertainment value of mercy. Ruth did not move at all, but Eli saw the slightest change in her mouth, the kind that happens when a person has just watched someone refuse the meanest use of their own power. Silas Boone looked at him for a long time. Then the old man did something pride usually forbids. He nodded. Not low, not grateful, only enough to admit he had been unmistakably wrong. The association voted before noon. Warren Boone would stand trial in county court for fraud and stock theft, though Silas spent the next month selling a tract south of Dry Creek to keep his son out of prison on bond. The note on Ruth's store was torn before witnesses. The trap line was dragged into the yard behind the livery and broken apart with sledges while half the town watched. Men who had laughed at the story of Eli and the wolf now found reasons to come by his fence with spare lumber, or to ask after his shoulder, or to pretend they had always suspected dogs were the true trouble. Power seldom falls with music. More often it just stops being believed in. By autumn, Silas Boone still had land, still had money, still had a seat in church, but when he spoke at cattle meetings, men asked questions they had not asked before. His certainty no longer passed for proof. A man can survive being hated better than he can survive becoming unnecessary. Ruth's store changed next. Not overnight. Nothing honest does. But with the note gone and Boone's pressure lifted, she expanded the feed shelf, brought in better cloth before winter, and let Noah Pike keep accounts of penny candy so badly that children started coming in just to watch him fail arithmetic. Eli rode into town often enough for people to stop remarking on it. Sometimes he brought eggs. Sometimes harness repairs. Once, in July, he brought Ash. The wolf was near grown by then, all long legs and wary gold eyes, and caused such a stir on Main Street that Mrs. Pike crossed herself and the barber came out with shaving soap still on one ear. Ash stayed at Eli's heel only until a wagon rattled too hard over loose stone. Then it slipped under the boardwalk and vanished into shade, where it watched the world with the detached suspicion of a thing that had not agreed to civilization and did not mean to start now. Ruth found Eli later behind the store where Ash had chosen to lie under the stacked crates. "It will never belong to a house," she said. "I know. You still keeping a place for it." He looked at the wolf, then at Ruth. Not all company needs owning. That was as close to courting language as Eli Mercer had yet come, and it was clumsy enough to make her laugh. He took the laugh gratefully. The first time he kissed her, It was in September beside the fence line after they had spent an afternoon resetting posts washed loose by summer rain. The sun was low. Sweat had dried salt on the back of Ruth's neck. Eli had just tamped the last post solid and stood looking at the straightened line like a man considering whether work ever truly ended. Ruth handed him the hammer. Their fingers touched. That was all it took. He kissed her once, lightly, and stepped back as if prepared to be corrected. Ruth reached up, caught his shirt at the chest, and kissed him properly so that neither of them would have to wonder later what honesty might have felt like. They married in November with no ring speech worth repeating, no sermon long enough to matter, and only 6 people in attendance if one counted Noah Pike, who insisted on standing in the doorway because outside counts if the door's open. Ash was nowhere to be seen during the service and appeared only afterward, crossing the snowy edge of the pasture as if to confirm from a distance that the two fools had arranged themselves to its satisfaction. Winter settled hard that year, then passed. Months later, when the first green came back clean over the north pasture, people in the valley had grown used to a few things they had once sworn could not stand. Ruth Calder Mercer laughing in her store with her sleeves rolled. Eli Mercer speaking more than 3 words in town if the topic was one that mattered. Noah Pike older by an inch and no wiser. And a gray wolf appearing at dusk above the home pasture. Never close enough to touch, never far enough to lose. By the second spring there was a cradle in the spare room. Not because anyone said hope aloud before it was safe, but because Ruth had begun sewing small hymns in lamplight, and Eli had quietly planed the old walnut board straight. The house no longer sounded empty. It sounded used, lived in, forgiven. On evenings when the chores were done and the valley settled into that deep gold hour, just before the cold came back off the mountains, Eli would lean on the porch rail with Ruth beside him and watch Ash move along the far fence, pausing now and then to lift its head to the wind, as if reading a message only wild things could hear. The wolf never crossed the last 10 yards to the porch. It never had to. Some distances are not signs of absence. They are the shape respect takes when love has finally learned not to confuse itself with possession. One such evening, years after the trap by Little Goose Creek and the ring on the dusty table, the pie Ruth had set to cool on the sill was drawing cinnamon into the air, and a child inside the house was laughing at something Noah Pike had done to a string toy badly enough to make it better. Ash stood out in the grass, silvered by the falling light, free as weather and just as likely to return, and Eli touched Ruth's hand with the backs of his fingers and said, "The best things a man ever keeps are the ones that stayed free beside him," while the whole valley lay warm and unafraid around them. Next time, I will tell you about the widow who found a gold watch sewn into a dead stranger's coat and learned why 3 men had crossed 2 states to bury him under another name. Until then, keep the lamp low and the coffee warm.